Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second part of our video on transform settings, and in this part I want to talk about three important examples in which transcurrent and transform faults play a major tectonic role. The first one is the case of New Zealand. We see here a very simplified structural map of the North and the South Island of New Zealand. And we find here a subduction zone in the north where the Pacific plate in the east is subducted underneath the Australia plate in the west. In the south, there is another subduction zone that obviously continues further south, where oceanic lithosphere of the Australia plate is subducted underneath the Pacific plate. And these two segments of subduction zones are connected by the Alpine Fault, which is a dextral transform fault. We see here a Google Earth image of the North and the South Island, and here the subduction zone that continues further to the north. We are going to see an overview image on the next slides. And here we see how the subduction zone curves and converts into a transform fault towards the southern subduction zone segment that we see here in yellow. And when we look here at magnification of the western coastline of South Island, we see here the Alpine Fault forms a prominent topographic feature, a clearly visible lineament roughly parallel to the coastline of South Island with the New Zealand Alps to the east. That is where the Alpine Fault, the dextral transform fault, cuts through. In the regional context, we see that this belongs to the peri-Pacific tectonic subduction zones with a seismically extremely active area here in the northern part, where the plate boundary takes a very complex curvature. And here we have an array of shallow and deep and ultra-deep earthquakes that are very common. They are not often in the news simply because this is not a very densely populated area. But we can see here, back to the beginning of the recording of seismicity with modern methods, large earthquakes have taken place here in the vicinity of the Tonga Trench that we see here. New Zealand is a little bit further to the south, and we see seismicity is less intense and less common. But still, a few years back, there was a major earthquake in Christchurch, which is in this region here, and that had a lot to do with tectonics along the Alpine Fault that we see here again cutting through South Island. If we magnify this area, we can see here movement vectors of the Pacific plate and the Australia plate, and we see that on average the Tasman Sea of the Australia plate moves at 40 millimeters per year to the east-northeast, whereas the Pacific plate moves in opposite direction a little bit faster with about 50 millimeter per year. And that causes here a subduction zone which consumes the oceanic lithosphere of the Pacific plate. In the south, the kinematics are opposite. The subduction zone is dipping eastwards, and the oceanic lithosphere of the Tasman Sea is subducted underneath the South Pacific oceanic plate. The reason why we get strike-slip faulting along the connection between these two subduction zone segments is simply geometry. If we have movement vectors in the direction as indicated, a fault that is roughly parallel to this plate movement would not cause subduction. The two plates, the Australia plate and the Pacific plate along the Alpine Fault, simply pass along each other with dextral movement, following the north-northeast movement of the Australia plate and the west-southwest movement of the Pacific plate. The second example is the San Andreas Fault, and I believe it is virtually impossible not to talk about this structure in a video on transform faults. And compared to the tectonic situation in New Zealand, Southern California is significantly more complex. We see here an overview map with a lot of tectonic features indicated. California here grading into the Baja California of Mexico. And we see here the border between the United States and Mexico. This region is transected by a very large curving strike-slip fault, which is the San Andreas Fault. And we can see that the San Andreas Fault is not a single fault zone as it is shown here in the large-scale overview with only very few segmentations and parallel faults. It is actually a very complex grouping of strike-slip faults and curving bends, particularly here in the transverse ranges where we have a leftward bend in a dextral strike-slip fault. And as you will have seen from the previous video, this creates a restraining bend in the San Andreas Fault zone. The San Andreas Fault is important because there are two very large urban centers built right on or in direct vicinity to it, Los Angeles and San Francisco. San Francisco is virtually in the middle of the San Andreas Fault. Los Angeles is very close to the restraining bend of the transverse ranges, and therefore both are prone to be exposed to seismic activity, and seismicity in Southern California is an experience that you are very likely to have if you spend some time in this region. We can see here in the north there is a set of transform faults and a mid-oceanic ridge, and there is a subduction zone further north in northernmost California going towards Oregon, and we see on top of this subduction zone a string of volcanoes has formed and is still active. You might remember the very major eruptions in the early 1980s in Mount St. Helens, a little bit further north than shown on this map. We see that the mid-oceanic ridges and the connecting transform faults are undergoing subduction in this area. And the same is the case with mid-oceanic ridge segments and connecting transform faults that are located in the Baja California. And also those are related to subduction. A little bit further south there we would see a subduction zone underneath Central America. This situation we have discussed briefly in the previous video on transform faults and transcurrent faults. That is the type case for the San Andreas Fault. Let's try to understand how this complex pattern of strike-slip faulting, curving bends, and subduction zones has evolved over time and how it is likely to evolve in the future. We can see that here in sequential sketches that reach 35 million years back into the past. And at that time, the North American Western Plate boundary was a purely subduction zone dominated tectonic setting, a Andean type tectonic setting, under which the Farallon Plate was undergoing subduction. And at that time, we would have found volcanoes not only in Northern California and further up in Oregon. We would have found Andean type volcanic settings all along the North American plate boundary. The Pacific plate was not in direct contact with the North American plate at that time. The Pacific plate has a movement vector to the northwest, and this is caused by this mid-oceanic ridge, which further to the south curves into a roughly northeast southwest orientation, and that is pushing the Pacific plates to the northwest. The Farallon plate is pushed to the east because of the orientation of the mid-oceanic ridge segments that create this plate. At about 25 million years ago, a protruding segment of these mid-oceanic ridge segments had become subducted, and at that time the northwest moving Pacific plate came into direct contact with the North American plate. And if we have a Pacific plate movement to the northwest, we create a relative dextral strike slip movement in that area where the Pacific plate and the North American plate are now in contact due to the subduction of the Farallon plate. Since that time, we distinguish between the Juan de Fuca plate in the north and the Cocos plate in the south, although technically they are actually both part of the Farallon plate. But now they are no longer connected at the surface, and this is why they have been given two different names. The subduction of the Farallon or Juan de Fuca and Cocos plate has continued since then, and 20 million years ago we see that the strike-slip fault segment had grown in length because more and more of the Juan de Fuca and Cocos plates had become subducted, and the interface between the North American plate and the Pacific plate had grown in length. Accordingly, subduction stopped at this area because now the Pacific plate moves parallel to the coastline. So there is no longer any reason for subduction. We see that this process continued, and 10 million years ago the subduction zone ended further north, and the dextral San Andreas Fault is now cutting through the continental margin along the boundary of the North American plate and the Pacific plate, and this has carried on to the present day, where we see a very substantial strike-slip zone in Southern California. I believe the graphics that we see here are not entirely correct. These mid-oceanic ridge segments that we see here are not in northern Mexico. They are actually submerged in the Baja California that we see here protruding into the North American continent. Accordingly, the growth of the San Andreas Fault in length in the past 25 million years is a result of the increasing subduction of the Cocos plate and the Juan de Fuca plate, which allow the North American plate to come increasingly in direct contact with the Pacific plate, which is no longer subducting but is sliding more or less parallel to the boundary of the North American continent, causing this very large strike-slip zone of the San Andreas Fault. Because the San Andreas Fault is connecting the subduction zone in the north and the subducting mid-oceanic ridge of the Juan de Fuca plate and the mid-oceanic ridge segments that form the boundary between the Cocos plate and the Pacific plate, we consider the San Andreas Fault as a transform fault. The last example I want to talk about is the Kahramanmaraş earthquake sequence from February 2023. It started in the morning of the 6th of February, and lots of aftershocks were recorded for the rest of the month. This earthquake sequence caused a death toll of about 60,000 people, mostly in Turkey, lots of them also in neighboring Syria. There was widespread damage in a large area of about 350,000 square kilometers, which is the size of countries like Zimbabwe or Germany or Northern Cape province in South Africa. So the size of a small country, a very large area was affected by this seismic sequence. The damage it did had a profound effect on the Turkish economy and caused long-lasting effects on regional infrastructure and livelihoods. And it will take several years to rebuild the infrastructure and the destroyed settlements, villages, and cities. In financial terms, the estimated damage is almost 150 billion US dollars, which is about 9% of Turkey's GDP. And in Syria, the damage was smaller, about 15 billion US dollars. But of course, Syria already was in a political crisis at the time and has a much weaker economy than Turkey. So also for Syria, this was a very major blow. Let's find out what actually happened. Here is an overview of the tectonic situation of the Middle East. And in the Middle East, there are a number of plate boundaries which are tectonically active due to the mobility of the tectonic plates involved. We see here in the northeast a collision zone between the Eurasian plate and the Arabia plate, which is forming the Zagros origin in Iran. We see the African plate in the south, separated from the Arabia plate by the Red Sea rift, which is developing into a small narrow oceanic basin. We find a subduction zone separating Europe and in this part here the Anatolian plate from the African plate, with subduction underneath the northern Anatolian and European plates due to the northwards movement of the African plate. We want to focus on the East Anatolian Fault, which is a sinistral strike-slip fault, a conjugated fault related to the dextral North Anatolian Fault that reaches all the way to Istanbul. There is also an important connection with the Dead Sea Transform Fault, which connects the mid-oceanic rift of the Red Sea with the East Anatolian Fault and also with the subduction zone at the plate margin between Africa and Europe and the Anatolian plate. Accordingly, this area here is at a junction between Europe, the Arabian plate, the African plate, and it's also not far away here from the Eurasian plate. We must not be surprised that there is a lot of seismic activity in this region. In the early morning hours of the 6th of February at 4:17 local time, there was the major earthquake shock. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake took place very close to a major city, Gaziantep, in southeast Turkey, not far away from the Syrian border. And we see here the plate boundaries between the African plate, the Anatolian plate, and the Arabia plate. Highlighted here the East Anatolian Fault with a sinistral movement indicating that the Anatolian plate is shifted westwards compared to the Arabia plate. This is a snapshot from the early afternoon of this day, and we see that a few hours after this major earthquake in the Gaziantep area, there was a second 7.5 magnitude earthquake in the early afternoon, a little bit further north of the East Anatolian Fault. So this was technically not an aftershock of this major earthquake. This was a seismic event along a separate structure, as we will see on the next few slides. At that time, and we are seeing here only the major earthquakes larger than magnitude 5, we already saw plenty of secondary earthquakes along the various tectonic boundaries in this region. And by then, most of the damage was done So these seismic events that we see here are the major earthquakes that caused the devastation in that very large region in East Anatolia and in northwestern Syria. Mid-morning on the 7th of February, we see that further earthquakes are delivering a clearer pattern what actually is happening. We see that this earthquake from the afternoon of the previous day is associated with an array of seismic events that leads us away from the East Anatolian Fault westwards into the interior of the Anatolian plate with numerous further earthquakes that form such an east-west trending pattern. On this map, we see a summary of the earthquakes in the entire time between the first major earthquake on the 6th of February and the end of the month. There were a number of aftershocks in March and April, and also in the following month. There was some minor seismic activity in the region, but what we see here are all the major earthquakes related to the large Kahramanmaraş earthquake sequence of early 2023. Let's have a look at the driving forces for this seismic event. We can learn about the reasons of these tectonics when we look at movement vectors of the various tectonic plates involved. We see here the Arabia plate is moving with about 24 millimeters in northern direction. This varies a little bit here along strike. We see here in the area of the Emirates and Oman, the Arabia plate is a little bit faster with about 34 millimeters per year, and the movement vector is slightly different, but here in the region that is interesting to us and relevant to the Kahramanmaraş earthquake sequence, 24 millimeters northward movement, that is pushing the Anatolian plate to the west. The Anatolian plate tries to get out of the way of the Arabia plate, which is moving northwards. In the region of Turkey, the Anatolian plate has a escape route to the west by dextral movement along the North Anatolian Fault and sinistral movement along the East Anatolian Fault. The African plate is moving northwards, but is slower than the Arabian plate. So with about 10 millimeters northward movement, we find subduction of what is left of the oceanic plate of Africa. Most of the ocean that once separated Europe from Africa already has been subducted, and we see still ongoing subduction here in the Aegeus and also further to the west. This causes a lot of seismic and also some volcanic activity in the upper plate of Greece and western Turkey. The faster movement of the Arabia plate compared to the African plate also allows a rifting and formation of the Red Sea Ocean with a spreading rate of 11 to 15 millimeters per year. That is the spreading rate that allows the Red Sea to grow and to produce further oceanic crust. The Dead Sea Transform Fault is the plate boundary between the Arabian plate and the African plate away from the rift zone, and because we are neither creating nor destroying lithosphere along this boundary, it is a transform fault, along of which the faster northward movement compared to the African plate is accommodated by sinistral strike slip. On these maps, we see a little bit more detail on the complex tectonics of the Anatolian plate and the plate boundaries between Africa, Arabia, and Eurasia, and the Anatolian plate. We see here the East Anatolian Fault zone, sinistral movement with on average 11 millimeters per year, obviously much higher strain rates during the Karaman-Marash seismic event. But we see there are several other faults that have the same kinematics. The Central Anatolian Fault Zone is a major one, but also here the Malatya-Ovachik Fault Zone is very important for the seismic events from February 2023. We see here the Malatya Fault Zone curves in a right bend into the Ovachik Fault Zone. Both of them are sinistral, but if you have a right bend in a sinistral fault zone, you will find that this creates a restraining bend. And it is this restraining bend along of which the 7.5 magnitude earthquake in the afternoon of the 6th of February took place. This map comes from Ildrim et al. 2016, obviously a study predating the major earthquake in 2023. The map from Duman and Emre 2013 shows a larger overview that also includes the Aegean Sea. I want to highlight in this regard the important correlation between the sinistral East Anatolian Fault and the dextral North Anatolian Fault. Both are conjugated strike-slip faults which allow escape tectonics of the Anatolian plate to the west as a consequence of the northward movement of the Arabian plate against the Eurasian plate in the north. The seismic events that we are talking about occurred, as we have seen, along the East Anatolian Fault in about this region, but also along the bend in the Malatya-Ovachik Fault Zone in this area. And the distribution of the two main events is clearly related to two different structures. The initial one, 7.9, to the East Anatolian Fault, and the 7.5 secondary event a few hours later is related to the Malatya-Ovachik Fault Zone in its restraining bend further north. So clearly the one is not an aftershock of the other, but of course we can assume that this area already was seismically at the brink of slipping, and the major earthquake triggered the seismic slip along the restraining bend of the neighboring major strike-slip fault. This is all for now about these three examples of important transform and strike-slip tectonic settings in New Zealand, California, and in the Middle East. All of them are currently active seismic zones, and I believe we do not have to wait for very long to hear more news about the tectonic activity in these regions. Thank you very much for your attention.